The story of Atlantis does not begin underwater. It begins on land, in words, written by a single man in ancient Greece. Around 360 BC, the philosopher Plato recorded a tale that would outlive him by more than 2,000 years. Without his writings, Atlantis would not exist as a mystery at all. There would be no debates about lost underwater cities, no searches for sunken structures, and no questions about submerged civilizations. Everything starts with Plato, and more specifically with two of his works, Timaeus and Critias. Plato was not a historian in the modern sense. He was a philosopher born in Athens around 428 BC, a student of Socrates and later the teacher of Aristotle. His writings were often structured as dialogues, conversations between characters meant to explore ideas about ethics, politics, nature, and society. These dialogues mixed reasoning with storytelling. Some included myths, others used imagined scenarios to explain real ideas. This matters because Atlantis appears in exactly this kind of setting. In Timaeus, Plato introduces Atlantis briefly, almost in passing. The dialogue is set as a conversation among several figures, including Socrates. During this discussion, Critias, one of the speakers, claims to know a very old story about Athens and a powerful enemy it once faced. That enemy, he says, was Atlantis. The mention is short but specific enough to catch attention. Plato then returns to the story in much greater detail in Critias, which appears to be written as a continuation. According to Critias, the story of Atlantis did not originate with Plato or even with Greece. He says it was passed down through his family, starting with Solon, a famous Athenian lawmaker who lived around 600 BC. Solon, Plato tells us, traveled to Egypt and spoke with priests in the city of Sais. These priests allegedly showed Solon ancient records written on temple walls. In those records was the story of Atlantis, describing events that took place 9,000 years before Solon's time. This detail alone is striking. If taken literally, Plato was placing Atlantis around 9,600 BC, far earlier than most known civilizations. The Egyptian priests, according to the account, claim that the Greeks had forgotten much of their own ancient history due to repeated natural disasters, while Egypt preserved records through long periods of stability. It is from these Egyptian records, Plato says, that the story of Atlantis survived. Plato describes Atlantis as a large island located beyond the Pillars of Heracles, a term generally understood to refer to the Strait of Gibraltar. Beyond this gateway, he writes, lay a vast island larger than Libya and Asia combined, at least as those regions were known to the ancient Greeks. From Atlantis, travelers could supposedly reach other islands and even a great continent beyond. This geography has fueled centuries of speculation, but at this stage, it is important to focus on what Plato actually wrote, not later interpretations. In Plato's account, Atlantis was a powerful and wealthy civilization. Its society was highly organized, ruled by kings descended from the god Poseidon and a mortal woman named Cleito. The island was divided into regions, with a capital city built in concentric rings of land and water. Canals, bridges, and harbors connected the city, allowing ships to move easily. The land was fertile, producing crops, metals, and timber. Plato even mentions a mysterious metal called orichalcum, said to be highly valued in Atlantis, second only to gold. The political structure of Atlantis was also carefully described. The kings ruled according to laws passed down from Poseidon, meeting regularly to make decisions and judge disputes. For a long time, Atlantis was portrayed as a just and balanced society, but Plato makes it clear that this balance did not last. Over time, the divine nature of the Atlanteans faded. Greed and desire for power grew stronger. Eventually, Atlantis attempted to expand its influence, launching an attack against other lands, including ancient Athens. In this part of the story, Plato presents Athens as a moral counterpoint. The ancient Athenians, he claims, were virtuous and disciplined, standing alone against the aggressive Atlantean Empire. Despite being outnumbered, Athens defeated Atlantis and freed other regions from its control. Shortly after this conflict, Plato writes, catastrophic natural disasters struck. In a single day and night of earthquakes and floods, Atlantis sank into the sea and disappeared. This sudden destruction is one of the most famous elements of the story. Plato describes the sea where Atlantis once stood as becoming shallow and muddy, impassable to ships. This image has often been linked to ideas about sunken structures and unexplained ruins beneath the ocean. But again, this is Plato's description, and it exists only in his texts. What makes the Atlantis story especially complicated is Plato's intention. Nowhere does he clearly state whether Atlantis was meant to be a true historical account or a constructed tale. In Timaeus, Critias insists that the story is true, not invented like a myth. But Plato often used fictional narratives to express philosophical ideas. Many scholars point out that Atlantis mirrors themes Plato explored elsewhere, especially the idea that societies rise when they are virtuous and fall when they become corrupt. There is also the fact that Critias ends abruptly. The dialogue breaks off before Plato finishes describing the war and destruction. Some believe the work was never completed. Others suggest the ending was intentionally left unfinished. Either way, this absence leaves room for uncertainty and debate. No other ancient Greek writer before Plato mentions Atlantis. There are no independent Egyptian records that confirm the story. No inscriptions, no lists of kings, no clear references outside Plato's work. This lack of supporting evidence is one reason many historians and classicists view Atlantis as a philosophical allegory rather than a record of a real place. At the same time, Plato's detailed descriptions set Atlantis apart from simple myth. Unlike vague legends, he provides names, dates, locations, and political systems. This level of detail has encouraged generations of readers to wonder whether Plato was preserving a distorted memory of real events. It is this tension between literary construction and apparent specificity that keeps the mystery alive. From the beginning, then, Atlantis exists in a gray area. It is not clearly labeled as fiction, nor is it supported as history. Plato presents it as a story passed down through respected sources, yet he embeds it within philosophical dialogues designed to teach moral lessons. This ambiguity is not a flaw in the story. It is the reason the story endures. Every later discussion about deep-sea mystery, lost underwater cities, or ancient ocean discoveries traces back to these pages. Before there were expeditions, maps, or theories about submerged civilizations, there was simply a philosopher writing about the rise and fall of a powerful island. Understanding this origin does not solve the mystery of Atlantis, but it sets clear boundaries. It shows us what is actually written, what is claimed, and what remains uncertain. And that uncertainty is the foundation on which everything else is built. To understand why the story of Atlantis appeared when it did, it helps to step into the world Plato lived in. Ancient Greece was not a place that separated history, philosophy, and storytelling the way we do today. Ideas were shared through spoken debate, public discussion, and carefully crafted stories. Plato was writing for an audience that expected lessons to come wrapped in narrative. For them, a story was not the opposite of truth. It was often the way truth was explored. Greek culture had a long tradition of using myths to explain the world. These myths were not always meant to be taken literally. They were tools. Through stories about gods, heroes, and fallen cities, Greek thinkers examined human behavior, justice, power, and failure. Homer's Iliad and Odyssey were not history books, but they shaped how Greeks understood war, honor, and fate. Hesiod's works explain the origins of the gods while also offering moral guidance. Plato inherited this tradition, but he reshaped it for philosophy. Plato often criticized poets for misleading people with myths, yet he continued to use stories himself. The difference was intent. Plato's stories were carefully designed to make people think. When he described ideal societies or failed civilizations, he was asking his audience to reflect on how states should be governed and why they collapse. Atlantis fits into this pattern. It is presented during a discussion about the nature of the perfect city, immediately linking it to political and moral questions. Another important element of Plato's world was the Greek view of Egypt. To the Greeks, Egypt represented deep antiquity and preserved knowledge. Egyptian temples, monuments, and writing systems were far older than anything in Greece. Greek travelers, including Herodotus centuries earlier, wrote about Egypt as a place where history stretched back farther than memory. Egyptian priests were often described as keepers of ancient records, guardians of truths forgotten elsewhere. When Plato claims that the story of Atlantis came from Egyptian records shown to Solon, he was drawing on this cultural respect. His audience would have found the idea believable, not because they could verify it, but because Egypt symbolized continuity. Greece, by contrast, saw itself as a younger civilization that had suffered repeated disruptions. Wars, invasions, and natural disasters were part of its remembered past. Those disasters were not imaginary. The ancient Mediterranean was a region shaped by earthquakes, floods, and volcanic activity. Greece sits along active fault lines, and written records confirm frequent earthquakes. Coastal flooding was common, especially during storms. These events were not abstract fears. They were lived experiences passed down through generations. One of the most dramatic events in the wider region was the eruption of Thera, also known as Santorini, around 1600 BC. Modern science has confirmed it as one of the largest volcanic eruptions in human history. It sent ash across the eastern Mediterranean and likely caused tsunamis. While this event occurred long before Plato's lifetime, its effects were remembered indirectly through stories of destruction and sudden collapse. The Minoan civilization on Crete was deeply affected by this eruption. Archaeology shows that Minoan cities suffered damage, and while the civilization did not vanish overnight, it declined over time. To later Greeks, the Minoans represented an advanced society with impressive architecture, trade networks, and art. By Plato's era, they were a shadowy memory, known mostly through ruins and legend. The Mycenaeans, another Bronze Age civilization, also collapsed around 1200 BC. Their palaces were destroyed, writing systems disappeared, and population levels dropped. This collapse marked the beginning of what historians later called the Greek Dark Ages. For centuries, complex societies gave way to simpler ones. Writing was lost and then rediscovered much later. Plato lived with the knowledge that civilizations could fall. His own city, Athens, had experienced war, defeat, and political turmoil. The Peloponnesian War against Sparta ended only a few decades before he wrote Timaeus and Critias. Athens lost its empire, its confidence, and many of its citizens. Plato had seen democracy fail and tyrants rise. The idea that a powerful society could destroy itself through moral decline was not theoretical to him. This historical memory shaped how stories were understood. When Plato described Atlantis as advanced, wealthy, and eventually corrupt, his audience recognized the pattern. They had seen it happen closer to home. The difference was scale. Atlantis was larger, richer, and more dramatic, but its downfall followed a familiar logic. Flood stories also played a role in ancient thinking. Greek myths included several tales of great floods, most famously the story of Deucalion, who survived a flood sent by Zeus to punish humanity. Similar flood myths existed across the Mediterranean and Near East. These stories were not treated as scientific accounts, but as explanations for ancient ruins, strange landscapes, and gaps in memory. In a world without modern geology, floods and earthquakes were the best explanations for why cities disappeared. When people encountered unexplained ruins or sunken structures along coastlines, they did not see them as ordinary erosion. They saw them as evidence of past disasters. This mindset made the idea of a lost island civilization feel reasonable. Plato's audience did not imagine deep-sea mystery in the modern sense. They did not think about underwater archaeology or submerged civilizations as we do today. But they were familiar with coastal changes. Sea levels rose and fell over time. Harbors silted up, shorelines shifted. A city once near the sea could later appear inland or vanish beneath the water. This matters because Atlantis was described as disappearing into the sea, not being destroyed by enemies. The ocean was a natural boundary and a place of uncertainty. Beyond the known seas lay the unknown. When Plato placed Atlantis beyond the Pillars of Heracles, he located it at the edge of the world as Greeks understood it. That location carried symbolic weight. At the same time, Plato was careful. He did not connect Atlantis to known civilizations like the Minoans or Mycenaeans. He did not say it was Egypt, Crete, or any Greek land. This separation allowed the story to function as a universal example rather than a historical claim that could be easily challenged. What is important here is not whether Plato secretly based Atlantis on a real place. There is no evidence he did. What matters is that his world was full of reminders that civilizations rise and fall, sometimes suddenly. Ruins existed without clear explanations. Old stories filled the gaps where written records were missing. In that context, Atlantis was not fantasy in the modern sense. It was a plausible story within a shared understanding of history, disaster, and memory. Plato's audience would not have asked for proof in the way we do now. They would have asked what the story meant. By grounding Atlantis in familiar fears and respected traditions, Plato ensured the story would endure. He placed it at the intersection of philosophy, history, and legend. That is why it still attracts attention today, whether discussed as ancient ocean discoveries, unexplained ruins, or the possibility of lost underwater cities. The mystery of Atlantis did not begin with explorers or sonar scans. It began with a way of thinking about the past. Plato's world made room for lost civilizations without needing certainty. That mindset is what allowed Atlantis to take root and remain alive in human imagination for centuries to come. For many centuries after Plato wrote about Atlantis, the story stayed mostly where it began, inside books. Ancient writers debated its meaning, but few tried to find it. That changed slowly, as the world itself became more accessible. As maps expanded and coastlines were explored, Atlantis moved from philosophy into investigation. The question was no longer only what the story meant, but where, if anywhere, it might have existed. The earliest attempts to locate Atlantis appeared in the ancient world itself. Writers like Strabo and Pliny the Elder mentioned islands beyond the known Mediterranean, but they did not claim to have found Atlantis. Most classical scholars treated Plato's account with caution. They recognized its detail, but they also understood Plato's habit of using stories to teach ideas. For them, Atlantis was interesting, but not a destination. During the Middle Ages, interest in Atlantis faded. European scholars focused more on religious texts than classical philosophy. Plato's work survived mainly through preservation in monasteries and later through translations in the Islamic world. Atlantis remained a footnote, not a goal. Everything changed during the Age of Exploration. From the 15th century onward, European explorers crossed oceans that ancient Greeks had only imagined. The Atlantic Ocean, once a symbolic boundary beyond the Pillars of Heracles, became a real space filled with islands, coastlines, and new lands. As maps grew more detailed, readers returned to Plato with fresh curiosity. If Atlantis lay beyond Gibraltar, some wondered, could it have been somewhere in the Atlantic? One of the earliest modern attempts to place Atlantis geographically came from Athanasius Kircher, a 17th century Jesuit scholar. In 1665, Kircher published a map showing Atlantis as a large island in the Atlantic Ocean, roughly between Europe and the Americas. His map was based entirely on interpretation of Plato, not on archaeological evidence. Still, it reflected a growing shift. Atlantis was no longer just a story, it was being drawn onto maps. In the 19th century, this trend accelerated. The period was marked by confidence in progress and a belief that science could explain ancient mysteries. One of the most influential figures was Ignatius Donnelly, an American writer and politician. In 1882, he published Atlantis, the Antediluvian World. Donnelly argued that Atlantis was a real, advanced civilization that served as the source of knowledge for Egypt, Mesopotamia, and the Americas. Donnelly pointed to similarities in architecture, myths, and symbols across cultures. He suggested that pyramids, flood legends, and shared motifs were remnants of Atlantean influence. His book became extremely popular, shaping public imagination for generations. However, scholars criticized his methods. He relied heavily on selective comparisons and assumed connections without direct evidence. While Donnelly helped revive interest in Atlantis, his work blurred the line between research and speculation. At the same time, other researchers looked closer to home. Some proposed that Atlantis was not in the open Atlantic at all, but in the Mediterranean. The island of Thera, now known as Santorini, became a key candidate. Its volcanic eruption around 1600 BC was well documented by archaeology. The explosion destroyed settlements and reshaped the island, leaving a flooded caldera. Supporters of this idea noted similarities between Plato's account and the Minoan civilization. The Minoans were wealthy, maritime-focused, and technologically advanced for their time. They also suffered decline after natural disasters. Some suggested that Plato's Atlantis was a distant memory of the Minoan world, exaggerated and displaced in time. Yet problems remained. Santorini does not lie beyond the Pillars of Heracles. Its size does not match Plato's description of a vast island, and the timeline does not align with Plato's claim of events occurring thousands of years earlier. Most archaeologists see the Minoan connection as inspiration at best, not identification. Other Mediterranean locations were also proposed. Some pointed to Sardinia, with its ancient Nuraga towers and early seafaring culture. Others suggested Cyprus, or even regions near Spain. Each proposal relied on matching parts of Plato's description to known features, but each also required overlooking key details that did not fit. As underwater exploration improved in the 20th century, attention shifted again. Advances in diving technology, sonar, and underwater archaeology revealed submerged settlements along coastlines. In places like the Aegean Sea, the Mediterranean, and the Black Sea, researchers discovered ancient harbors, walls, and buildings now beneath the water due to rising sea levels. These discoveries were real and important. Sites like Pavlopetri in Greece, a submerged Bronze Age town, showed that coastal cities could indeed be lost to the sea. Pavlopetri, mapped in detail by archaeologists in the 1960s, dates to around 2800 BC and includes streets, buildings, and tombs. It is one of the oldest known submerged cities. Findings like this renewed public interest in lost underwater cities and ancient ocean discoveries. They demonstrated that sunken structures were not fantasy. However, none of these sites matched Plato's Atlantis. They were smaller regional settlements, not vast island empires. They also fit well within known historical timelines. Some researchers turned to the Atlantic again, focusing on submerged features near the Azores, the Canary Islands, or the coast of Morocco. From time to time, sonar images or unusual rock formations sparked excitement. Media reports sometimes labeled these as unexplained ruins, but follow-up studies usually showed them to be natural formations shaped by geological processes. One major challenge in all these searches is erosion. Coastlines change constantly. Waves, currents, and storms break down structures over time. Even if a large settlement had existed near the sea thousands of years ago, much of it could be scattered or buried. Rising sea levels since the end of the last ice age have flooded vast areas of former coastline. This makes underwater archaeology difficult and incomplete. Another challenge is interpretation. Plato's descriptions are specific, but they are also literary. He describes concentric rings of land and water, grand temples, and precise measurements. Some researchers treat these details as literal blueprints. Others see them as symbolic, reflecting Plato's interest in order, balance, and geometry. Depending on which approach is taken, the same text can lead to very different conclusions. There is also the problem of confirmation bias. Once a researcher believes Atlantis was in a certain location, it becomes easy to interpret evidence in that direction. A harbor becomes a canal. A hill becomes a temple platform. Without inscriptions, written records, or clear cultural links, such interpretations remain uncertain. Modern archaeology relies on multiple lines of evidence. A site must be dated accurately. Its culture must be understood in context. Artifacts must connect to known traditions. For Atlantis, none of this exists. There are no inscriptions naming it, no artifacts clearly linked to Plato's description, no records outside his dialogues. This absence does not mean the search was pointless. On the contrary, attempts to locate Atlantis pushed researchers to explore coastlines, study sea level changes, and refine underwater archaeology techniques. In that sense, the search became part of the mystery. It revealed how much of human history lies beneath the sea, even if Atlantis itself remains unconfirmed. What becomes clear over time is that Atlantis cannot be pinned to a single spot on a map without forcing the evidence. Every proposed location explains some details and fails others. The Atlantic fits the geography but lacks archaeological proof. The Mediterranean offers real civilizations and disasters, but conflicts with Plato's placement and scale. Rather than resolving the mystery, these efforts highlight its limits. They show how fragile ancient evidence can be, how easily stories shift over time, and how modern expectations shape interpretation. Atlantis resists being located because it was never anchored in physical evidence to begin with. In the end, the attempt to find Atlantis tells us as much about ourselves as it does about the past. It reflects a desire to turn stories into places, ideas into coordinates. The continued search, careful or speculative, keeps Atlantis alive not as a destination, but as a question. The mystery endures not because it has been hidden too well, but because it exists at the edge of what evidence can support. And it is in that space between map and meaning that Atlantis continues to drift. By the time modern science emerged, Atlantis was no longer just a story passed down through books. It had become a question that scholars felt obligated to address, not because they believed it must be real, but because it refused to disappear. For historians, classicists, archaeologists, and geologists, Atlantis became a test case. It forced them to explain how ancient texts should be read, how evidence is weighed, and where the boundary lies between story and history. Most modern scholars begin with Plato himself. In academic study, Plato is understood primarily as a philosopher, not a chronicler of events. His works were written to explore ideas about justice, power, ethics, and the ideal state. Atlantis appears during a discussion about what makes a society virtuous and why civilizations collapse. This context matters. Plato was not listing historical facts. He was constructing an argument. Classicists who study Plato closely point out that Atlantis mirrors themes found throughout his work. The Atlanteans begin as balanced and orderly, then slowly decline as greed overtakes restraint. This pattern appears again and again in Plato's thinking. He believed societies fail when moral discipline is lost. From this perspective, Atlantis functions as an extended example, not a forgotten chapter of world history. Another reason scholars treat Atlantis as allegory is its isolation in the historical record. No Greek writer before Plato mentions it. No Egyptian texts confirm it. Later writers who discuss Atlantis are always responding to Plato, never adding independent evidence. In historical research, a single source without corroboration is treated with caution. This does not mean the source is false, but it cannot stand alone. Archaeologists approach the question differently. Their work depends on physical remains, tools, buildings, inscriptions, and landscapes that can be dated and studied. Over more than a century of systematic archaeology around the Mediterranean and Atlantic coastlines, no site has emerged that matches Plato's Atlantis in scale, description, and age. There are no cities from 9,600 BC with monumental architecture, organized harbors, and complex political systems. Human societies at that time were primarily small, mobile groups, not island empires. Geology adds another layer to the discussion. Plato describes Atlantis sinking into the sea in a single day and night. Modern Earth science has a strong understanding of how landmasses move and change. Plate tectonics shows that continents do not suddenly vanish. Islands can be reshaped by volcanic eruptions or earthquakes, but a landmass the size Plato describes could not disappear without leaving clear geological traces. Sea level studies also challenge Plato's timeline. Around the end of the last ice age, sea levels did rise significantly as glaciers melted. This flooded many coastal areas and created submerged landscapes that underwater archaeology now explores. However, these changes happened gradually over thousands of years, not suddenly. They also occurred much earlier than Plato's supposed date for Atlantis's destruction. For many scientists, these conflicts are decisive. Plato's timeline does not align with what is known about human development, climate history, or geology. From this viewpoint, Atlantis cannot be a literal account of a lost civilization. It must be symbolic, exaggerated, or fictional. Yet the scholarly debate does not end there. Some researchers argue that dismissing Atlantis entirely may be too simple. They suggest that Plato could have drawn inspiration from real events, even if he reshaped them for philosophical purposes. This idea does not claim Atlantis existed as described. Instead, it proposes that fragments of memory, disaster, and cultural contact were woven into a larger narrative. One example often discussed is the Bronze Age collapse. Around 1200 BC, several advanced societies in the eastern Mediterranean declined or fell within a relatively short time. The Mycenaeans, Hittites, and other cultures experienced destruction, population loss, and political breakdown. While this occurred thousands of years after Plato's date for Atlantis, it shows that complex societies can collapse in dramatic ways. Natural disasters also play a role in this interpretation. Events like the eruption of Thera demonstrate how a powerful civilization can be damaged by forces beyond its control. Archaeological evidence confirms widespread disruption following the eruption, including tsunamis and ash fallout. Some scholars suggest that stories of such events could have been passed down orally, growing more dramatic over time. In this view, Atlantis becomes a composite. It is not a map location, but a memory shaped by centuries of retelling. Plato, drawing on Egyptian stories, Greek traditions, and his own ideas, may have created a narrative that felt ancient and authoritative without being historically precise. Historians are careful with this approach. Oral traditions can preserve kernels of truth, but they also change significantly. Dates shift, places merge, details are added or lost. By the time a story is written down, it may reflect more about the storyteller's world than the original events. This makes it difficult to use such stories as historical evidence. Another important factor in modern debate is methodology. Scholars emphasize how easy it is to read modern expectations into ancient texts. Plato's descriptions of canals, walls, and planned cities can sound modern, especially to readers familiar with large-scale engineering. But ancient writers often use idealized geometry and symmetry as symbols of order. What sounds like a blueprint may actually be metaphor. Underwater archaeology has added nuance to the conversation. The discovery of submerged settlements proves that rising seas did erase parts of human history. Sites like Pavlopetri show organized towns now beneath the water, preserved by sediment. These finds confirm that lost underwater cities are real, even if Atlantis itself remains unverified. Because of this, some scholars argue that the question should not be, was Atlantis real? But why does the story persist? The answer lies partly in how humans understand the past. Stories of collapse resonate because they reflect real experiences. Societies have fallen. Knowledge has been lost. Ruins exist without clear explanations. The academic community generally agrees on one point: belief is not evidence. Whether someone wants Atlantis to be real does not change the historical record. At the same time, respectful disagreement remains. Scholars continue to examine Plato's texts, compare them with archaeological data, and refine geological models. The debate persists not because of stubbornness, but because the story touches many disciplines at once. Importantly, modern scholars do not accuse Plato of deception. They recognize his brilliance and influence. Many argue that Atlantis works precisely because it feels real enough to provoke thought. By placing moral lessons inside a detailed narrative, Plato ensured they would be remembered. The ambiguity was a feature, not a flaw. This explains why Atlantis still sits at the center of discussion despite centuries of study. It cannot be confirmed, but it also cannot be dismissed casually. It exists in a space where philosophy meets history and where science must explain not just what happened, but how stories shape understanding. In the end, the scholarly debate over Atlantis is not a failure of research. It is an example of it. It shows how evidence is tested, how claims are challenged, and how uncertainty is handled. Atlantis remains debated not because science has ignored it, but because science has examined it carefully and found its limits. The mystery survives not as a lost place waiting to be found, but as a question about interpretation. And that question continues to invite careful thought, long after the island itself has slipped beyond reach. Atlantis still matters because it refuses to settle into a single meaning. After centuries of study, debate, and disappointment, the story remains present in human thought, not as a proven place, but as a powerful idea. It survives because it speaks to concerns that never fully disappear: the rise of societies, the misuse of power, the loss of knowledge, and the fear that even the most advanced civilizations are not permanent. From the moment Plato wrote about Atlantis, the story carried more than geography. It carried a warning. Atlantis was wealthy, technologically capable by ancient standards, and confident in its strength. Yet it fell not because it lacked resources, but because it lost balance. That message has echoed through history. Empires rose and fell long after Plato, and readers repeatedly saw their own world reflected in his words. Atlantis became a mirror, not a map. As centuries passed, the story adapted. During the Renaissance, scholars revisited classical texts with fresh curiosity. Atlantis was discussed alongside newly discovered lands across the Atlantic. Some wondered whether Plato's island could have been an early reference to the Americas. These ideas were speculative, but they show how Atlantis absorbed new meanings as the known world expanded. It became a symbol of hidden chapters in human history. In the modern era, books, films, and documentaries brought Atlantis to an even wider audience. Popular media often presents the story with dramatic visuals of sunken structures and lost underwater cities, blending Plato's account with modern imagery. These portrayals rarely claim certainty. Instead, they invite viewers into the mystery. The line between fact and interpretation becomes blurred, not to deceive, but to keep curiosity alive. This blending is one reason Atlantis continues to attract attention. It sits comfortably between disciplines. Historians discuss its textual origins. Philosophers explore its moral lessons. Archaeologists investigate submerged sites that show how coastlines changed. Filmmakers and writers translate all of this into narratives that feel timeless. Atlantis becomes a shared reference point across science, art, and imagination. Modern discoveries have also played a role. Over the past few decades, underwater archaeology has revealed that parts of human history truly do lie beneath the sea. Settlements like Pavlopetri in Greece demonstrate that organized towns were flooded as sea levels rose. Other submerged sites near India, Japan, and the Mediterranean show walls, roads, and foundations preserved underwater. These are real ancient ocean discoveries, carefully studied and dated. None of these sites are Atlantis. Archaeologists are clear about that, yet their existence changes how people think. They prove that sunken structures are not fantasy. They confirm that rising seas erase parts of the human story. Each discovery renews interest, not because it confirms Plato's tale, but because it reminds us how incomplete the historical record can be. This is where Atlantis gains new relevance. It becomes a symbol for all that may have been lost without trace, not just cities, but ideas, languages, and ways of life. Humans have always feared forgetting. Written records preserve memory, but only when they survive. Atlantis represents the possibility that something important slipped away before it could be recorded clearly. At the same time, Atlantis also warns against overconfidence in progress. Plato described a society that believed itself superior, only to collapse suddenly. That idea resonates strongly in the modern world. Technological advancement does not guarantee wisdom. Economic power does not ensure stability. Environmental changes, political conflict, and moral choices still shape outcomes. Atlantis remains relevant because its lesson feels unfinished. There is also a psychological element. Humans are drawn to mysteries that cannot be fully solved. Clear answers close doors. Open questions invite exploration. Atlantis offers just enough detail to feel real and just enough uncertainty to resist closure. This balance keeps it alive in discussion without forcing belief. Importantly, Atlantis endures not because science has failed, but because science has done its job. Careful research has shown what is unlikely. Archaeology has mapped ancient coastlines. Geology has explained how land changes. History has clarified Plato's context. What remains is not ignorance, but interpretation. This distinction matters. The mystery of Atlantis today is not about hidden ruins waiting to be discovered by chance. It is about how humans process stories from the past. Plato's words are fixed, but their meaning shifts with time. Each generation reads Atlantis through its own experiences, concerns, and hopes. For some, Atlantis represents lost knowledge, the idea that ancient civilizations understood things modern societies have forgotten. For others, it is a cautionary tale about power and decline. For many, it is simply a fascinating story that bridges history and imagination without needing resolution. Even the debates surrounding Atlantis have value. They demonstrate how evidence is evaluated and how claims are tested. They show the difference between curiosity and belief. In this way, Atlantis has contributed to public understanding of archaeology and history, encouraging skepticism alongside wonder. It is also worth noting that Atlantis has shaped how people approach other mysteries. Discussions about submerged civilizations, unexplained ruins, and underwater archaeology are often framed more carefully because of past exaggerations. Scholars emphasize evidence precisely because Atlantis taught them how easily stories can outgrow facts. In a quiet way, Atlantis has helped refine the tools used to study the past. It has encouraged interdisciplinary thinking, bringing together texts, landscapes, and science. Even as a symbolic story, it has influenced real research. The true endurance of Atlantis lies in its flexibility. It does not demand belief. It invites reflection. It asks questions without insisting on answers. Where did we come from? What do we value? How fragile are our achievements? These questions remain relevant regardless of whether Atlantis ever existed as a place. In the end, Atlantis may matter most not for what it was, but for what it reveals about us. It shows how humans search for meaning in history, how we balance imagination with evidence, and how stories shape understanding across centuries. Atlantis exists at the intersection of memory and myth, science and philosophy. That is why the mystery remains open. Not because it cannot be solved, but because its purpose was never solely to be solved. Atlantis continues to matter because it reminds us that history is not just a record of events. It is also a conversation, one that continues long after the waves have closed over the past.